Dr. Flanders has conducted extensive research about the illegal mobile voting van that was used in my home state of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify here today. First, I think it's important to set the table about where the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty stands on election integrity issues more broadly. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, Will, and I'm not talking about myself in the third person here, we're talking about the organization Will henceforth, conducted an assessment of the election that was referred to by the Wall Street Journal as the best assessment of what happened. We found that while almost certainly the number of votes that did not comply with existing legal requirements exceeded Joe Biden's margin of victory in Wisconsin, there was no evidence that we uncovered of widespread voter fraud. Indeed, President Biden likely received more votes from eligible voters in Wisconsin than did President Trump. That said, there are credible reasons that the 2020 election shook the faith of many Americans in the electoral process. With the justification of the COVID-19 pandemic, many systems and rules were unilaterally abandoned without following proper legislative procedure, and new techniques were used to drive targeted voter turnout that existed in legal gray areas. This called into question the fundamental fairness of the election process. It is some of these issues that I'm here to discuss today. The prospect of private funding of elections ought to be of concern to voters across the political spectrum. Take any of the conservative boogeymen of the left, the Koch brothers, for example, and imagine they're sending money directly to election officials almost entirely in conservative-leaning areas of the nation. I feel confident in predicting that the same folks who are now complacent would be complaining loudly about the injustice of it. Yet that is what is happening with the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL funding. CTCL records for Wisconsin indicate that 216 communities across Wisconsin received a grant. Madison and Milwaukee, however, received a disproportionate share of the funding, about 45%, despite only representing about 14% of the state's population. In a statistical analysis, we compared the change in turnout between 2016 and 20 with whether or not a community received a CTCL grant. We found that communities that received a CTCL funding saw an increase in the number of votes for Democratic candidates in 2020 that was greater than in communities that did not receive the funding. On average, this works out to about 8,000 votes across the state of Wisconsin that can be correlated with CTCL funding. So while in our work we did dismiss what Representative Morelli called some conspiracy theories, like for example with the voting machines, this is a very real situation. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's also important to note that CTCL grants were likely legal under Wisconsin law at the time they were made. As was mentioned, there have been efforts to, in subsequent years, to ban these grants that have not been signed into law by the governor. We currently have a constitutional amendment that will be going on to the ballot this fall to let the voters decide whether or not we want this funding to continue. This is important because even if we took CTCL at their word that this was a nonpartisan process, it doesn't mean that the next person to engage in similar tactics will even have the slightest lip service given to nonpartisanship. What we can say for certain is that CTCL did provide funding for a program that was ultimately judged to be illegal. As was mentioned by Chairman Stile, before the 2021 elections, the city of Racine introduced a mobile voting unit. This unit was purchased with CTCL funding in 2021, and the stated purpose of the van was to park in various areas around the city and allow people to fill out absentee ballots. Will has a legal arm, and our legal arm believed that the van was illegal under Wisconsin law for a number of different reasons. What we'll focus on today was a Wisconsin statute on absentee voting that states no site may be selected which provides an advantage to any political party. While other absentee ballot drop-off locations are in fixed buildings, Racine's mobile voting unit presented unique problems when it came to election fairness. Using data from the 2016, 18, and 20 general elections, we tried to determine the average partisan makeup of each ward in Racine. We found as the share of Democratic voters in a ward increased, so did the expected number of locations of the voting van in that ward. Across wards that were ultimately used in the 2022 primary, a hypothetical ward with 100% Democratic voters was expected to have 0.25 more voting locations than a ward with 0% Democratic voters. Looking at the list of all possible van locations, that number increased to 2.25. There are any number of reasons that the sites may have been selected. In the worst case scenario for election integrity, they may have been strategically chosen to benefit aligned politicians. In a more favorable light, they may have been chosen randomly to disperse throughout the city. Nevertheless, in the eyes of the law, the reasoning is irrelevant. If the locations chosen benefited one party over the other, and the van did, then the van was illegal. In the end, both of these issues come back to the concept of fairness and an equal application of the law to every American, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. I hope that we can all agree it is in America's interest that those on both sides of the aisle have their faith restored in our electoral process. Unfair election practices like those being discussed today only serve to undermine that faith and lend credibility to those who put forth less defensible claims of election fraud. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we'll welcome any questions later.
Mr. Flanders, I want to say before the 2020 election, did the states or localities accept private monetary donations to help them with elections administration?
Yeah, so, while there could be some small example that, for a dog catcher race or something like that, we're not aware of any widespread funding of elections, certainly not to the level that we saw with the CTCL funding. So the answer to that is no, as far as I know.
Okay, so should public officials be accepting donations from organizations like the CTCL in the first place?
Yeah, so I think what we've heard today, and even from some folks on the other side, right, is that there are concerns when this money is being provided to local election officials, and I think the answer is absolutely not. And it's good to hear that there might be some bipartisan agreement on that question.
Okay, so what are, let's go back to this. What are some of the dangers that you could see that are associated with accepting this funds?
Yeah, so I think what we see here is, and you can put aside the sort of whether or not this was strategic. I think we mostly would say that it was strategic, but say these grants were provided just to larger communities because they thought larger cities needed more help. Well, that does lead to a partisan bias in the outcomes, and I think we're on a slippery slope here. Again, you could take them at their word. You could take CTCL at their word that they did this in a nonpartisan way, but without legal changes, there's nothing to say the next person who does this will even give any lip service whatsoever to doing this in a nonpartisan way, and there's no limitation on that.
With that, does accepting private funds for alleged purposes of election administration increase voters' confidence in election process or the result, in your opinion?
Absolutely not. There's some polling from last year. I saw a 2022 poll that the majority of Americans think this funding should be banned, and I think when people learn more about the process, as we're doing here today, those numbers would even go up higher.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Mr. Flanders, Dr. Flanders, I'm sorry. We know that 27 states have now enacted legislation prohibiting Zuckerbucks or the private funding of our elections. But in some states like Wisconsin and Michigan, Democrat governors have vetoed the legislation. Why have they vetoed these bills, and why do you believe the states should prioritize oversight over private money infiltrating election administration?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is what we see here today, that this issue that is a very real issue is being conflated with many other election integrity issues. And I think that on the part of our own state, speaking about Wisconsin, Governor Evers has a track record of sort of refusing to implement any sort of reforms to election integrity. That, and you can even go to another level and say potentially they see the benefits of continuing this funding given what we see in the election results where it has been beneficial to folks on the left.
Okay, and obviously they tried to sell it as Zuckerbucks being this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic idea. Then why shouldn't these bills pass overwhelmingly?
Yeah, you would think so, right? If it's just for the pandemic, we are past the pandemic, thankfully. But what we see is that municipalities didn't even spend all the money that they received. The Racine voting ban that we discussed in the beginning wasn't even used until elections post-2020. So I think there's no reason to think that even if it's not CTCL, there might be others that will engage in similar activity in the future without the excuse of the pandemic.
So it seems like with the infiltration of Zuckerbucks, in some places, pure common sense has gone away.
Absolutely.
Dr. Flanders, I'll start with you. Do you have any thoughts on that? And if we were to try to engage in supporting state and local election officials, how should we do so?
Yeah, so I think there was some discussion earlier about whether this is a state issue or whether this is a federal issue, right? And I think that we always have to be cognizant of federal strings that come with any new election funding. But I think, the important thing here is when we discuss the notion of private funding, I think we need to recognize the remedy comes from more public funding, whether it comes from the federal level or the state level. It's certainly a question to debate. And obviously, I think as a conservative libertarian leaning organization, we'd probably prefer that come from the state level to the extent possible. But the important thing is let's get the private funds out, and then we can determine where the best source of state and local funds is.
So let me jump over to you, Mr. Flanders. If I can, I want to go to the 2022 Racine, Wisconsin use of their Zuckerbucks funding for the illegal voting van. How did this work in practice? Did it stop in front of specific locations? Did it have a partisan bias?
Yeah, that's right. The city determined where the locations the van would park would be, and there were 22 locations that it actually ultimately parked in throughout the August primary. And when we did an analysis looking at where those were located, they were more likely to be located in Democratic-leaning areas than Republican-leaning areas of Racine.
So they took the voting van that was labeled as a clerk's office that looks like a food truck and specifically drove it to Democratic-leaning areas of the city. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
And did they match that and equally go to Republican-leaning jurisdictions?
They did not. They were more likely to go to Democratic-leaning areas.
So
than
they
Republican
utilized the funds to drive forward a partisan agenda. And is that illegal in the state of Wisconsin?
areas. That is illegal under state law, yes,
And
sir.
the judge ruled that it was illegal, correct?
Correct.
And now, since 2020, now let me step out a little bit bigger picture. Since 2020, 27 states have banned Zuckerbucks. Is that correct?
Yes.
But in the state of Wisconsin, Governor Evers actually vetoed the ban of Zuckerbucks not once but twice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so this could all happen again in the state of Wisconsin this election cycle. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
That's the problem. So as we're having a conversation about the challenge that we face, it's the reason we have to ban this at the federal level, and it's the reason that at the local and state level, we need to see every state follow the actions of 20 other states, including states like Pennsylvania that took the action to actually ban Zuckerbucks. I appreciate our witnesses being here.